In February 2025, Germany announced something that should have made headlines everywhere. Permanent brigade-level forces would be stationed in Lithuania by 2027. German troops positioned on Russia's border, not rotating through, not on exercise. Permanent deployment. The first time since 1944 that German soldiers will maintain long-term presence along Russia's frontier. For most observers, this sounds reasonable. Russia invaded Ukraine. NATO is reinforcing its eastern flank. Germany is finally contributing its fair share. But for anyone watching strategic patterns rather than political narratives, this represents something far more significant. Germany just crossed a threshold. It spent 80 years carefully avoiding. This isn't a documentary about whether Germany is defending Europe. That question misses the point entirely. What we're examining is whether Germany is transforming Europe's relationship with Russia from managed competition into structural confrontation. There's a difference, and that difference will define the next decade. German leaders insist they're simply responding to threats. Deterrence. Defense. Reasonable precautions. Yet the military infrastructure being built, the command arrangements being established, and the political commitments being made all assume one thing: permanent hostility with Russia, not crisis management. Not temporary tension, permanent. So why is Germany leading this transformation instead of reluctantly following? What changed inside Berlin's strategic culture? Are German defense planners preparing for deterrence, or are they preparing for war itself? Most analysts see Germany finally stepping up. But the real story isn't about Germany doing more. It's about Germany fundamentally changing what Europe is prepared to do. To understand why this matters, we first need to see exactly what Germany has done since February 2022 and how quickly the changes have accelerated. 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood before the Bundestag and announced a Zeitenwende, a turning point. He committed 100 billion euros to military modernization and pledged Germany would finally meet NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target. For a country that had spent decades treating military investment as almost morally suspect, this was already remarkable. But that was just the beginning. Within weeks, Germany abandoned Nord Stream 2, the pipeline project that had defined its energy relationship with Russia for over a decade. It ended long-standing restrictions on exporting weapons to active conflict zones. By early 2023, Germany authorized Leopard tank deliveries to Ukraine, crossing a red line that Berlin had insisted was uncrossable just months earlier. Then came the institutional changes. Germany backed EU defense bonds, a mechanism that would make military spending a permanent budget priority across the bloc. It accelerated procurement of F-35 fighter jets, signaling commitment to NATO nuclear sharing arrangements. The Bundeswehr's personnel target expanded from 185,000 to 203,000 troops. And in the Baltics, Germany agreed to permanent forward presence, not rotational deployments, but standing forces with infrastructure, families, and long-term basing agreements. By 2024 and 2025, the pace accelerated further. Germany unveiled Operations Plan Deutschland, a homeland defense strategy that treated Russian attack on German territory as plausible enough to require concrete preparation. Joint European ammunition procurement initiatives positioned Germany as the continent's industrial arsenal. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius began speaking openly about Germany needing to be war-ready by 2029. The political landscape shifted accordingly. Scholz, a reluctant pragmatist by instinct, found himself managing pressures from Pistorius, an increasingly assertive voice within his own government, and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, whose moral interventionism pushed for even stronger positions. Meanwhile, the opposition CDU criticized the government not for doing too much, but for moving too slowly. This happened against a backdrop of economic recession, coalition tensions, and rising support for the AfD, a party explicitly opposed to confrontation with Russia. Yet despite every political and economic pressure to cut spending, security investments remained untouchable. These aren't isolated policy adjustments. They're interconnected architecture, each decision enabling the next, each commitment making reversal harder. These policy changes are dramatic, but they're symptoms, not causes. The real question is why Germany's entire strategic class abandoned decades of consensus almost overnight. To grasp what's driving this transformation, we need to understand what Germany spent 75 years trying to avoid and why that restraint is now collapsing. Germany, quote, post-1945 consensus emerged from catastrophic failure. 2 world wars, both driven by German militarism, left the country divided, occupied, and morally shattered. The lesson wasn't simply that Germany had lost. It was that German military power, when allowed to operate independently, produced devastation on a continental scale. So the Federal Republic was built on a principle: Never again would Germany possess autonomous military strength. The institutional architecture enforcing this was comprehensive. Germany's armed forces were integrated into NATO from the beginning, ensuring they could operate only under alliance command structures. The Basic Law Germany's constitution restricted the Bundeswehr to defensive missions and required parliamentary approval for deployments. But beyond legal constraints, there emerged something deeper. A culture of restraint embedded in military doctrine, political discourse, and public consciousness. The Bundeswehr wasn't simply limited by law, it was limited by identity. The Cold War created a paradox. West Germany maintained a large military, over 500,000 personnel in the 1980s, because it sat on the front line of potential Soviet invasion. But this was never an independent strategic force. It existed as part of NATO's collective defense structure, defending German territory within an alliance framework. The Bundeswehr had significant capability, but zero strategic autonomy. After reunification, the logic shifted entirely. With the Soviet threat gone and European integration deepening, Germany embraced what was called the peace dividend. Military budgets were cut, personnel numbers dropped. The focus moved to out-of-area peacekeeping missions, stabilization operations in the Balkans, Africa, Afghanistan. Missions that posed minimal risk and required minimal capability. This reflected a broader strategic bet, one that defined the Merkel era. Germany's leadership believed that economic interdependence with Russia created more security than military strength ever could. This was Ostpolitik's legacy, the conviction that engagement, trade, and dialogue could transform Russia into a partner. If that worked, territorial defense became obsolete. The Bundeswehr's primary mission wasn't deterring Russia. It was contributing to international stabilization, while Germany's real security work happened through economics and diplomacy. Nord Stream became the physical embodiment of this strategy. It wasn't just a pipeline, it was a peace pipeline, creating mutual dependence that would make conflict irrational. Germany needed Russian energy. Russia needed German revenue and technology. This was security policy by economic integration. The consequences for military readiness were severe. By 2014, the Bundeswehr had roughly 30% operational readiness. Equipment was aging. Training was limited. Ammunition stocks were minimal. By 2022, Germany couldn't sustain a brigade-level deployment without significant Allied support. This wasn't neglect. It was policy. Germany had decided it didn't need that capability. So this wasn't pacifism for purely ideological reasons. It was a calculated strategy based on assumptions that the security environment would remain benign, that economic integration would constrain aggression, and that American security guarantees would cover any remaining risks. February 2022 shattered all three assumptions simultaneously. Russia invaded Ukraine, proving economic interdependence didn't prevent war. And the possibility of reduced American commitment already visible during the Trump years made European dependence on Washington look dangerously fragile. The shock wasn't just that Russia attacked. It was that Germany's entire post-Cold War security architecture had been built on illusions. So Germany spent decades building a security model that assumed Russia would never need to be confronted militarily. But here's what most people miss. Germany isn't just abandoning that model. It's building the opposite. Which brings us to the core question. What exactly is Germany building now, and why does it go far beyond simple deterrence? There's a crucial distinction that most coverage misses. Reactive defense means responding to immediate threats with measures you can scale back when the threat recedes. Structural confrontation means building permanent architecture that assumes long-term hostility architecture that becomes difficult or impossible to dismantle, even if conditions change. Germany isn't doing the former, it's doing the latter. Start with the military dimension. Germany's deployment to Lithuania isn't rotational crisis response, it's permanent basing. That means infrastructure. Barracks, maintenance facilities, command centers, logistics hubs. It means families relocating. It means long-term integration with Lithuanian forces and NATO command structures. This commits Germany to the territorial defense of the Baltic states in a way that makes German casualties inevitable in any Russia-NATO conflict. During the Cold War, the Bundeswehr defended German soil. German forces were positioned to protect German territory, which created obvious political legitimacy. What's happening now is fundamentally different. German soldiers are being positioned as frontline tripwire forces on Russia's border, hundreds of kilometers from Germany itself. This isn't defensive deterrence. It's forward deterrence, a posture designed to make any Russian move against the Baltics automatically a war with Germany. Then there's the industrial transformation. Germany isn't just rebuilding its own military. It's positioning itself as Europe's arsenal. Joint ammunition procurement initiatives, artillery production scaling, tank manufacturing expansion, coordination with Nordic and Eastern European defense industries, all of this creates dependencies. Countries that rely on German ammunition, spare parts, and production capacity become locked into German-led supply chains. This gives Berlin structural influence over European military options. If Poland, the Baltics, or Nordic countries depend on German industrial output to sustain operations, then Germany effectively shapes when and how they can act. It's not formal command authority. It's something potentially more durable. Economic dependency in the defense sector. The political dimension operates similarly. Germany is embedding confrontation into European Union structures in ways that make reversal institutionally difficult. EU defense bonds would make military spending a permanent budgetary priority across the bloc, not a discretionary national choice. Support for majority voting on security matters removes national vetoes, meaning countries opposed to confrontation lose the ability to block collective decisions. Backing permanent sanctions architecture turns economic warfare into embedded EU policy rather than temporary crisis response. These aren't technocratic adjustments, they're structural locks. Once defense bonds are institutionalized, once sanctions become permanent legal frameworks, once decision-making shifts to majority voting, de-escalation requires dismantling institutions, not just changing policies. That's exponentially harder. Perhaps most revealing is the narrative transformation inside Germany itself. German political discourse has shifted from treating war as unthinkable to treating war as manageable. Defense Minister Pistorius speaks openly about Germany needing to be war-ready by 2029. The Operations Plan Deutschland treats Russian attack on German territory as plausible enough to require detailed civil defense preparation. Public campaigns are beginning to normalize the idea that conflict could come. This creates political space. In 2021, decisions that risked escalation with Russia were almost impossible to justify domestically. By 2025, those same decisions are presented as prudent preparation. The normalization of conflict as a possibility fundamentally changes what political leaders can do. Their quote S, also an American dimension that rarely gets discussed openly. Germany's actions suggest preparation for scenarios where U.S. security commitments weaken, whether through a second Trump administration explicitly questioning NATO, an American strategic pivot fully toward Asia, or U.S. domestic political crisis reducing Washington's international engagement. By building European capacity for autonomous action, Germany ensures that confrontation with Russia can continue even if America steps back. That's not alliance burden sharing. That's hedging against alliance collapse. But here's the deeper strategic calculation that ties everything together. German planners likely assess that Russia's window of conventional military advantage is closing. The war in Ukraine has severely degraded Russian ground forces. Sanctions constrain reconstitution. Russian demographics are worsening. Western intelligence estimates suggest Russia won't fully rebuild conventional capability until the early 2030s at the earliest. This creates a strategic window. If Germany institutionalizes confrontation now while Russia is weakened, it locks in a favorable balance of power before Russia can recover. The risk Germany appears to be guarding against isn't Russian strength in 2025. It's Russian recovery by 2035, combined with potential Western fatigue, political changes in Europe, or reduced American commitment. So the deeper story becomes clear. Germany isn't preparing to deter a strong Russia. It's racing to lock in permanent confrontation with a weakened Russia before strategic conditions potentially shift. The official narrative is reactive. We're responding to threats. The structural reality is anticipatory. We're building architecture that prevents future normalization. So Germany isn't just defending Europe from Russia. It's building a system where confrontation becomes self-sustaining. And that creates consequences most analysts are only beginning to recognize. Which raises the critical question. What happens when you build permanent confrontation into the architecture of European security? The immediate regional consequence is Eastern European empowerment. Poland, the Baltic states, and increasingly the Nordic countries have pushed for harder policies toward Russia for years: permanent forward presence, maximum military aid to Ukraine, complete energy decoupling, sanctions with no sunset clauses. But they lack the economic and military weight to make these preferences into European consensus. Germany's transformation changes that calculation entirely. When Berlin adopts positions previously held only by Warsaw and Vilnius, those positions become European policy rather than regional anxiety. This reverses decades of Franco-German moderation, where Paris and Berlin would temper Eastern European demands in favor of maintaining dialogue with Moscow. Now, the Eastern European threat assessment is validated by Europe's largest economy and most populous state. That's a fundamental shift in Europe's center of gravity. It also reshapes the Franco-German balance that has anchored European integration since the 1950s. France historically balanced German economic dominance with its own strategic autonomy, permanent UN Security Council seat, independent nuclear deterrent, diplomatic relationships that Paris maintained even when Berlin wouldn't. Macron's vision of European strategic autonomy assumed France would lead security policy, while Germany provided economic heft. Germany, quote, "S military and industrial mobilization destroys that arrangement." Berlin is now becoming Europe's security leader, not through formal authority, but through capability and willingness to act. France finds itself marginalized. Macron's reluctance to fully break with Russia, his calls for dialogue, his concern about humiliating Moscow, all of this now reads as weakness rather than sophistication. Paris is being reduced to secondary status in the domain where it claimed primacy. That creates resentment, and resentment creates future backlash. Economically, Germany is redirecting investment from civilian to military sectors on a scale not seen since rearmament in the 1950s. Combined with energy cost increases from decoupling from Russian supply, this locks Germany into a lower long-term growth trajectory. But it also creates a new political economy. Defense industries gain lobbying power. Constituencies emerge with vested interests in sustained confrontation. Once Rheinmetall, Krauss-Maffei, Wegmann, and Hensoldt are operating at scale with multi-year order books, they become political forces resistant to de-escalation that threatens revenue. The EU itself is transforming institutionally. Defense bonds and moves toward majority voting on security matter centralized decisions that were previously national prerogatives. This reduces the sovereignty of reluctant members, Hungary most obviously, but potentially Italy, Austria, or any future government skeptical of permanent confrontation. The EU either forces holdouts into line or fractures. Either outcome fundamentally changes what the European Union is. NATO dynamics shift as well. Germany's conventional buildup reduces European dependence on the American nuclear umbrella for day-to-day deterrence. That makes European autonomous military action more plausible, which could stabilize the alliance by addressing American burden-sharing complaints. Or it could destabilize NATO by reducing Washington's structural leverage over European decision-making. An increasingly capable Europe is in Europe that can ignore American preferences. Moscow, meanwhile, faces a strategic dilemma. Accept encirclement and focus resources on grinding out gains in Ukraine, or escalate against NATO expansion before it solidifies. Germany's forward presence raises the stakes in the Baltics specifically. A region that was always symbolically important to NATO now has German forces positioned as tripwires. That increases the risks of miscalculation, because any Russian probe in the Baltics now means immediate confrontation with Berlin. Globally. The consequences extend to US-China competition. If Europe becomes a permanent high-intensity military theater requiring sustained American attention and resources, Washington cannot fully execute its pivot to Asia. That means continued transatlantic pressure on China. Conversely, if European militarization genuinely allows significant American drawdown from the continent, China gains strategic breathing room as US focus and resources shift eastward. But the most fundamental consequence is this. Germany's actions are transforming European-Russian relations from managed competition into zero-sum confrontation. Managed competition assumes periods of tension and cooperation, dialogue channels, economic linkages that create shared interests, and the possibility of future normalization. Zero-sum confrontation assumes permanent hostility, minimal communication, economic decoupling, and preparation for conflict. Germany is systematically removing the pathways back to the former. These consequences are already unfolding, but they point towards specific scenarios that will define the next decade. So what actually happens next? There are several plausible paths, and none of them lead back to the Europe of 2020-1. What happens next isn't a single predetermined path. It's a series of branching possibilities, each shaped by decisions not yet made and events not yet unfolded. These are scenarios, not predictions, but they map the strategic terrain. Europe is now navigating. Scenario 1. Successful deterrence. Germany's military buildup, combined with Russia's degradation in Ukraine, convinces Moscow that NATO expansion into the Baltics is irreversible and that military options are futile. Russian leadership concludes that attempting to roll back NATO presence would be catastrophic, so they refocus on domestic consolidation, accept a smaller sphere of influence, and tacitly acknowledge that Eastern Europe is lost. Germany's forward presence never fires a shot. Deterrence works exactly as intended. The European economy adjusts to permanently higher defense spending. Publics across the continent accept this as the new normal. Confrontation settles into something resembling Cold War stability, high tension, zero trust, but managed through credible military balance. The risk here is obvious. This scenario requires Russian leadership to accept strategic defeat without escalation. That's not guaranteed, especially if domestic political pressures or leadership transitions change Moscow's calculus. Scenario 2. Escalation through miscalculation. As German forces complete their deployment to Lithuania and Russia, concludes operations in Ukraine, whether through frozen conflict or negotiated settlement incidents along the NATO-Russia border increase in frequency and severity. Military exercises come dangerously close to each other. Air intercepts become more aggressive. Cyber attacks probe infrastructure. Provocations accumulate. Then comes the miscalculation. Perhaps a Russian strike targets what Moscow believes is a logistics convoy supplying Ukraine, but it's actually a German military transport inside Lithuania. German soldiers are killed. Berlin faces overwhelming domestic pressure to respond. Article 5 is invoked. Neither side wants full-scale war, but both are locked into escalation by political commitments and military postures already in place. The conflict remains geographically limited to the Baltic region. Cyber domain, possibly tactical nuclear signaling to demonstrate resolve, but it shatters the European economy and fractures NATO cohesion. Even a limited war produces catastrophic consequences. Scenario 3, internal European fracture. Economic strain from sustained defense spending, elevated energy costs, and stagnant growth fuels populist backlash across Europe. Parties explicitly opposing confrontation with Russia, the AfD in Germany, Le Pen's national rally in France, Orban-aligned movements elsewhere gain significant power, potentially winning elections. Germany faces coalition collapse or outright electoral defeat that brings anti-militarization forces into government. The Zeitenwende is reversed. Eastern Europe feels betrayed. The EU splits between confrontation and accommodation camps, unable to maintain unified policy. Russia exploits the division, reasserting influence over non-NATO neighbors and peeling off European states willing to resume economic relationships. American frustration with European unreliability accelerates U.S. strategic withdrawal from the continent. Europe loses the ability to coordinate, and the security architecture collapses not through Russian military action, but through internal political disintegration. Scenario 4. Long militarization without war. Europe settles into a new equilibrium, permanently high defense spending, forward military presence, complete economic decoupling from Russia, but no shooting war. Germany becomes Europe's Prussia, militarily dominant, industrially mobilized, politically assertive. Russia becomes an isolated revisionist state, economically dependent on China, unable to challenge NATO conventionally, but never reconciled to its diminished status. Ukraine remains a frozen conflict, neither resolved nor escalated. This becomes the new normal. European societies militarize culturally. Defense industries come to dominate significant portions of national economies. Political discourse centers on security, readiness, and strategic competition. It's not peace in any meaningful sense. It's permanent, unstable equilibrium maintained by credible threat of overwhelming force. These scenarios aren't mutually exclusive. Elements can combine. A period of successful deterrence could give way to internal fracture. Miscalculation could occur even during long-term militarization. The trajectory depends on variables no one fully controls. Russian leadership decisions, the durability of American commitment, European economic resilience, how the war in Ukraine ultimately ends, and crises no one has foreseen. But one thing is certain across all scenarios, none of them lead back to the Europe of 2021. Path dependence is already set. Institutions are being built that will outlast the leaders building them. Economic interests are being created that will resist reversal. Military commitments are being made that will constrain future choices. What, quote, "s certain is this? The Europe being built now is fundamentally different from the one that existed 3 years ago, and Germany is the architect. Which brings us back to where we started. Is Germany pushing Europe toward war with Russia? So we return to the question we started with. Is Germany pushing Europe toward war with Russia? The answer requires precision. Germany isn't pushing for war in the sense of actively seeking conflict. German policymakers genuinely believe they're building deterrence, not provoking confrontation. But here's the strategic reality. Deterrence and provocation can be functionally indistinguishable from the other side's perspective. By deploying permanent forces to Russia's border, institutionalizing sanctions into European Union structures, building autonomous military-industrial capacity, and normalizing war readiness in public discourse, Germany is creating conditions where pathways to de-escalation progressively narrow. Each commitment makes reversal harder. Each institutional change embeds confrontation deeper into European functioning. Each military deployment raises the stakes of any future crisis. This isn't about intentions, it's about structures. And the structures being built assume permanent hostility. Germany, quote, S transformation reveals something fundamental about modern Europe. For decades, European security worked precisely because it avoided making hard choices, maintaining flexibility, keeping options open, balancing economic interests with security concerns, managing contradictions rather than resolving them. Germany, quote, S current path abandons that flexibility entirely. It represents a definitive choice: accept permanent confrontation with Russia in exchange for strategic autonomy from uncertain American guarantees and credible protection of Eastern European allies. Whether this choice proves strategically sound depends on assumptions about Russian intentions, about American reliability, about European economic and political resilience. None of those assumptions are certainties. The real test isn't whether Germany can build a military capable of deterring Russia. The Bundeswehr can be rebuilt. Equipment can be procured. Forces can be deployed. The real test is whether Germany can build a political system capable of sustaining permanent confrontation without either collapsing into war or collapsing into appeasement. History suggests Germany struggles with that particular balance. Escalation and capitulation have both been German responses to sustained strategic pressure. And there's this. The security architecture being constructed now will define Europe for decades. But unlike the post-1945 settlement built on total victory, occupation, and carefully negotiated constraints, this architecture is being improvised during crisis. That makes it simultaneously more adaptive and more fragile, more responsive to immediate threats, and more vulnerable to catastrophic miscalculation. The question isn't whether Germany is pushing Europe toward war with Russia. The question is whether the Europe Germany is building can avoid one.